Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Christian Rubio, Vice President, Strategic Advancement for Global Genes, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Global Genes is a nonprofit organization dedicated to eliminating the burdens and challenges of rare disease families, the burdens and challenges for rare diseases for patients and families globally. I'm pleased to be moderating and collaborating on this webinar today with CISCRP, a nonprofit organization dedicated to increasing awareness and transparency around clinical research. Today's webinar is part one in a three-part series on navigating rare diseases and clinical research. Every patient matters. Today, we will provide an overview of the rare disease landscape, clinical research overview, and follow that with a facilitated conversation. Next slide, please. Thank you again to everyone joining us today. We're thrilled you're here. And as a note, if we have time, we'll be selecting questions from the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit any questions you may have throughout the webinar. Before we start, a disclaimer that this presentation is not intended for continued medical education credit for healthcare providers. Next slide, please. Today, we'll first review the key learnings of this webinar. The rare disease landscape and facts, watch a 2-minute video on clinical research and the process, and hear a testimonial from Jen McNary, a trusted voice in the rare disease community as a mother, public figure, and passionate advocate. Next, we'll hear a more detailed overview of clinical research and the process, and we'll have a facilitated conversation with our panelists on a variety of topics, including what you can expect the first day of your clinical trial visit, ways that barriers and challenges are being addressed for rare disease patients, and what to know if your child participates in a clinical trial and what costs are covered. Please submit your questions in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Next slide, please. The key learnings from this webinar today will be learning about clinical trials, how they work in the process, and questions to ask in order to be informed. Gaining a better understanding of rare disease clinical trials by listening to a patient advocate share their personal story and experience, and hear from healthcare providers and patient advocates addressing specific questions about rare diseases, clinical trials, and other topics through a facilitated conversation. Next slide. And now here's a quick overview of the rare disease landscape and facts. A rare disease is any disease, disorder, illness, or condition that affects fewer than 200,000 people in the US. There are approximately 8,000 rare diseases, afflicting 30 million Americans, and 50% of people affected by rare diseases are children. Most rare diseases are genetic or have a genetic component, and 95% of rare diseases are without a single FDA-approved treatment. On average, it takes 7 years to receive an accurate diagnosis of a rare disease, and on average, it takes 7 clinicians to accurately diagnose a rare disease. Additionally, for many reasons, the signs may be observed at birth or in childhood during specific screenings in order to detect a rare disease early on. This may lead to opportunities for genetic testing. There are more than 500 types of rare cancers, all of which, and pediatric cancers are all considered rare. And sadly, many rare diseases result in premature deaths of infants and young children, or are fatal in early childhood. Now, before we watch a 2-minute video and the clinical research overview presentation, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists and speakers. Our first panelist is Dr. Johannes Daskier, who specializes in pediatric neurology and is the director of the Pediatric Neuromuscular Medicine Program at Goriab Children's Hospital in Morristown, New Jersey. Her current practice is primarily composed of patients with rare disorders, and she has personal experience as an investigator for clinical trials. Next, our second panelist is Mel Havert, and Mel has made her mission to rise above the health obstacles of chronic sickness within her own family and help others gain the knowledge and confidence to do the same. Our caregiver speaker and third panelist today is Jen McNary, a trusted voice in the rare disease community. As a mother of children who've participated in clinical trials, public speaker, and a fierce advocate for more patient and caregiver-centric clinical trials and drug development. Jen is both a consultant to industry with particular expertise in caregiver and patient engagement, and founder of One Rare, a nonprofit forum to address the needs of young adults living with rare and chronic conditions. Next slide, please. Our education overview speaker today is Stephanie Loomer, project manager of research services of CISCRP. Stephanie has a master's in medical anthropology and worked on research studies focusing on patient experiences within healthcare. She has recently worked on projects related to substance abuse and people living with HIV. Stephanie is incredibly passionate about working with vulnerable populations and increasing access to care for patients through research. And now we're going to play this a 2-minute video that provides a general overview of the clinical research process, which covers how are new treatments developed, why does development take so long, why do people choose to participate, and the video helps to frame the presentation and our facilitated conversation with the panelists that will happen after. After the video, we'll hear Jen's personal story.
People around the world are becoming more aware of new therapies that are being developed. These therapies, such as drugs and vaccines, are developed through clinical trials. All clinical trials begin with a question that scientists, including doctors and disease experts, want to answer. To do this, scientists prepare a development plan based on early studies done in the lab. Next, researchers submit a request to regulatory and government agencies, like the US Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicines Agency, to begin testing a new therapy in people. Once this request is approved, researchers seek volunteers to participate in clinical trials. The success of these trials depends on including a diverse group of people representative of those who may be treated by the new therapy if it is approved for use. There are 4 phases of clinical trials. During phase 1, a new therapy is given to a small group of participants. The goals are to check the safety, find a safe dose, and track any medical problems. During phase 2, researchers check the therapy's safety and how it works in participants with a specific disease or condition. During phase 3, researchers check the therapy's safety and how well it works in a larger group of people with a specific medical condition. Phase 4 trials happen after a therapy has been approved and made available to the public. Researchers look at how the therapy works in the real world and its long-term effects. This whole process could take over 8 years, and vaccine development typically takes even longer because there are more safety tests. This development process is important because it's the best way to ensure that the safest, most effective therapies reach the public.
Thank you so much for that. It's my pleasure now to introduce Jen McNary, who will share her personal story and experiences.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me today. And thank you, Christian, for a great introduction. I'll start with a little bit about me and a little bit about these lovely pictures that you see on your screen. I've elected to share, rather than just my face, some pictures of some trial participants, namely my son, Max. This is Max and his physical therapist extraordinaire, Dr. Linda Lowe's, during his clinical trial. And then, of course, Dr. Jerry Mendel, world-renowned Duchenne specialist, and some of the other guys in Max's study. So I'm the parent of 4. My 3 sons all live with rare diseases. My first 2 sons are now 22 and 19, living with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And then I also have a 3rd son living with 2 rare diseases, primary immune deficiency and congenital cholesteatoma. He is 13 years old. And then I have a daughter who at the moment is healthy. Our clinical trial journey really started with me having no knowledge of clinical trials. My sons were born with Duchenne muscular dystrophy and diagnosed when they were 3 years and 1 month old, And when they were diagnosed, I was told by the doctor that there were no treatments, no therapies, there was nothing I could do. And in fact, there were no clinical trials that we could even think about enrolling in, and no care that they needed for this early on. He actually said there is absolutely no benefit to having this diagnosis so early. Go home, love your children. They probably won't live to be adults. So as you can imagine, this was tragic. And I spent a lot of years working on raising money and funds for science and going to advocacy meetings. In fact, I'm participating in an advocacy meeting on the Hill virtually today in between other meetings. And so I spent a lot of time working on the science. Thankfully, when Max was 9 years old and his brother Austin was 12, we were allowed to participate in our first clinical trial. The interesting thing, though, is that it was a lot of work to get to this point. I had seen that some kids were being evaluated for a clinical trial in Columbus, Ohio. At the time, I lived in Vermont. And I messaged some of the parents who were flying to Columbus, Ohio, and said, "Hey, what is this? What is this that you're doing? What kind of care are you getting?" And they mentioned that it was specific to a certain mutation in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And so I dug out my kid's genetic report, and I realized that my kids actually had this genetic mutation and could qualify for the study. When I called the site, I called Columbus Nationwide Children's Hospital, and I asked them if my sons could be part of the study. They kind of told me that there were a few things that we had to do. The first thing was that we had to answer a few questions about the kids' mobility and ability to walk. Unfortunately, because Austin was 12 and had lost the ability to walk at age 10, he was not able to enter into the study or even be considered. But Max was the right age, and he was the right mutation, and he was functionally the right kind of kid that they were looking for to bring into this 12-patient study. And so I packed up Max and my newborn daughter at the time, Nora, and I left my 3-year-old son and my 12-year-old non-ambulant son with some family and friends, and we flew to Columbus, Ohio to meet with the doctors running this study. So I always liken studies in rare disease. They're different than studies in bigger populations because these studies in rare disease really take place in one location. And so travel is often necessary. And so we had families traveling from California and Florida and, all over the country to get to this one site. And it's also like trying out for a dance squad or a cheerleading squad or a baseball team, because your child has to really fit into this very narrow criteria. And that's important because when we're evaluating a therapy to find out if it works, we have to make sure all the participants are roughly in the same place progressively. And that's important, although it's hard to deal with. And so just to tell you how precarious our situation was, there were 15 kids evaluated for this study. Max was given a number and he was number 15, but only 12 kids were accepted, which meant that kids number 13 and 14 had to be declined for this study in order for Max to make it in. And so this can often be a devastating, potentially devastating process for families. And it's hugely a roller coaster of emotions. Once Max was allowed into the study, we began our weekly flights to Columbus, Ohio. During this process, none of the people in the study, so all 12 kids, attended every single appointment. This is 18 months, maybe even a little bit longer, of weekly trips to Columbus, Ohio, again, from as far away as California. And that shows the level of commitment that it takes to get a drug approved for a rare disease. Every patient matters. And so when you do sign up, although you have the choice and you have the option to quit at any time for any reason, it's important that you really consider this at the beginning of the study, because if you do quit, it can jeopardize science, and it can mean that that one dropout patient, you don't have the data in that patient. So we were all committed, and you can see that we were all valued because these kids got trophies, and I thought that was incredibly special. Max actually had to have 4 muscle biopsies. And one thing I learned during this study is he had to consent to that. He actually had to sign an assent form that said he would have those surgeries. And so this is something you have to talk to your family about. You have to talk to your children about. I also was faced with the fact that although Max was selected into the study, he had a chance of being on a placebo, which means that some of the kids in the study got a high dose of the drug, which was Max ultimately. Some of them got the lower dose of the drug, and then some of those kids didn't get the drug at all. So one of the questions that I asked when we were evaluating for this study was, what happens at the end of the study if my child didn't get the drug? Do they then get the drug? And that's called an extension study. And so I always ask at the beginning of a clinical trial, is there an extension planned? And will all of these patients actually get the active drug if it works? That was very important to me when I was evaluating this study as well. And I think lastly, my evaluation was, it entailed knowing what the cost was to me. I didn't have a lot of money, and a lot of patients do not have the money to fly weekly, stay in hotels, get rental cars. So I wanted to make sure that this was all going to be reimbursed and that patients were not going to have to pay for their time in a study. But it's important that you ask these kinds of questions to know what you're going to have to do in order to be part of this study. I'm happy to report that this drug, this was a positive example of being in a clinical trial, because this therapy was actually approved based on the study that Max was in, 12 patients in Columbus, Ohio. And so we're still on the hunt for the next best therapy. We're hoping to be accepted into another trial. I would give this experience a 10 out of 10.
Thank you so much, Jen. And that's a great point about about the discussion that's coming to the end. So please make sure, if you're watching the webinar through these different parts, that if you have questions for Jen, or if you have questions for the next section, to please use the Q&A box throughout the webinar so that we can address your questions during that discussion. Up next, Stephanie is going to provide an overview of clinical research and the process.
Thank you for the introduction, Christian, and thank you so much, Jen, for sharing your story. We're going to talk about clinical research today. So what is a clinical trial? It's a carefully designed study where researchers ask volunteers to do something like take a drug or treatment so they can answer a specific medical question. Questions like, does a treatment improve the health of participants with a certain medical condition? Is the treatment safe in the participants? Does a treatment have side effects? How should future participants take the medication? And does a treatment work any better for the participants than medicines that are already on the market? Because researchers are studying new investigational treatments, there are risks to participating in a clinical trial. But in all cases, something is learned from clinical research studies that helps inform medical knowledge and improve public health. Next slide. So what we learn from clinical research studies improves public health, and it all starts with these questions. How well does a new treatment work? Is there a better way to treat a disease? How does a disease get worse, and how can it be prevented? How are genes connected to illnesses? And does where people live change their health? Researchers can only answer these questions with the help of clinical research volunteers like Jen and her sons. So every clinical trial is reviewed, approved, and watched over by an independent local committee called an Institutional Review Board, or IRB. It is the law to have the IRB in place. The IRB makes sure a trial is ethical and fair, and that there is not too much risks for volunteers. During the trial, researchers must let the IRB know if there are any changes in the study plan, or if volunteers experience serious injuries or side effects. The IRB can end a trial if it feels volunteers are unsafe. Representatives from the federal government are also involved. The Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, reviews studies, inspects research centers, and monitors research groups to make sure they are following federal guidelines. Ultimately, the FDA has the final say in whether or not a treatment is approved in the US. All research involves risks, like I mentioned earlier. You could experience side effects associated with the study drug, and there may also be risks associated with some of the study procedures. And it is possible your symptoms may not improve or may get worse during the research study. But the study doctor or study staff will discuss all these possible risks and potential benefits in detail with you. One of the opportunities to discuss these risks and benefits is the informed consent process. It is designed to answer questions about the trial and is required by the FDA and IRB. This is one of the most important parts of research, and it's a term you're going to hear a lot. Before any volunteer can participate in a trial, they must read, understand, and sign the informed consent form. It is a long form that lists your rights as a volunteer and includes details about the clinical trial, such as the number of visits, procedures performed, and any required tests like blood draws, etc. It describes your role as a volunteer and any procedures or tests you'll need to have. It will also warn you about any known or unknown side effects of the study drug and detail the benefits and risks of participating in the trial. By signing the form, you're saying that you understand the clinical trial requirements and are agreeing to follow through with the study. The informed consent form is a complex document, and the study staff should go through it carefully with you and answer all your questions. You should never feel rushed or pressured to sign the form. It is important to note that the IRB can ask the researchers to translate the informed consent form to multiple languages that study volunteers prefer to speak. So let's talk about the different phases of a study and how long it typically takes to advance a new therapy. These phases are often larger for common diseases like Jen mentioned earlier. But rare disease clinical trials may look different or can be expedited. During phase 1 studies, a drug is tested for the first time with a very small number of volunteers, and often these volunteers are healthy. The goal of these clinical trials is to learn what is a safe dose, how does it work in the body, and is it harmful? In phase 2 studies, researchers begin to understand how well a drug works and if it is safe for patients who have a specific disease or condition. Like phase 1, safety is still the main goal. Phase 2 studies look to answer such basic questions as how much should people take and what are the usual side effects. Only about 1/3 of drugs that enter clinical testing ever successfully complete phase 2 and progress to larger and diverse group of patients in phase 3 studies. At this stage, researchers may check the drug's safety and how well it works in groups of patients. The trial may also compare the new drug with an already approved medication. And finally, phase 4 studies happen after a treatment has been approved by the Food and Drug Administration. Usually involve large numbers of diverse patients and look at real-world experience and checks to see if the drug works well over a longer period of time. As adult clinical trial participation is important, pediatric clinical trials are equally important. Children are a unique population with distinct developmental and physiological differences from adults. Clinical trials in children are essential to develop age-specific, empirically verified therapies to determine and improve the best medical treatment available. Additionally, these studies are conducted to see if a study medication, therapy, or device is safe and effective for children to use, find new treatments and improve upon existing treatments for children, compare existing treatments and learn more about them, and determine the appropriate dosages for children. There is additional oversight for pediatric clinical studies and safeguards as compared to adult studies. The Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, and National Institute of Health, or NIH, oversee the medical research in the US and protect the rights and welfare of children participating. The FDA Office of Pediatric Therapeutics is specifically dedicated to monitoring the growing number of clinical studies in the US involving children. Written permission of a parent or legal guardian is required before a child enrolls in a clinical trial, and a child may be required to also sign a consent form. So who is involved in clinical research? With each clinical trial, there is a team made up of first a principal investigator or a PI. These individuals organize and lead the clinical trial, record and studies the data, and directs the study staff team. There are also clinical research coordinators, also known as CRCs. They handle the day-to-day activities at the research center, work directly with the PI, and are the main point of contact for study volunteers. And like we just discussed, there are volunteer protections. So the IRB and FDA are involved in the research throughout the entirety of the clinical trial, again, to ensure that it is ethical and fair, that there is minimal to no risk for volunteers, and that everything is going according to the federal guidelines. But most importantly are the study volunteers. Without study volunteers, clinical research cannot happen. And finally, friends, family, and supporters. These individuals provide a support system for volunteers before and while they're taking part in the study. They can help volunteers develop questions to ask their doctor to make sure that a clinical trial is the best fit for them. And when we talk about clinical trials, all of them have different study designs. So here are some terms that you might hear as it applies to clinical trials. As a clinical trial participant, it is important to understand a few of these terms and their meanings. Clinical trials are set up so the research is fair, accurate, and unbiased. To accomplish this, study volunteers may be split into different groups, and this split is usually done by a computer program. The researcher and study volunteer do not get to decide which group the volunteer will be in. This is called a randomized clinical trial. Researchers at times will also blind a study. This means that the study volunteer and the researcher both do not know which treatment the volunteer is receiving. In some trials, researchers will also use a placebo. A placebo looks like the study medicine, but has no medicine in it, and therefore no therapeutic effect. If you're on a placebo, you will still be closely monitored by the PI and study staff, just like those volunteers also receiving the study drug. There are certain items to consider before participating in a clinical trial. This slide presents a few. Being a clinical trial participant takes time, commitment, and effort. You can work with the study staff to try and accommodate your schedule to the requirements of the study. Other items to note is the clinical trial could end at any time. You may not feel better or have any change in your condition. And it's important to be sure to let your doctors know you are in a clinical trial and have a contact number to reach the research study team in case of an emergency. Other elements to consider before participation is knowing as much as possible about the clinical trial. So it's important as a participant that you do your homework, learn more about the trial and ask questions, and read all of the information provided to you and or your loved one by the study staff. It's also important that you feel comfortable asking members of the healthcare team questions about the clinical trial, the care you should be expecting, and any costs you might incur as a participant. And also be prepared for meeting with the PI or research coordinator and study team. If you decide to join a study, you should feel confident that you have made an informed decision, and you should feel comfortable that the clinical trial staff will support you and answer all your questions. It's important to understand that being in a clinical trial is not the same as going to your doctor for care. When you go to your doctor, they will give you a treatment that has already been tested and approved by the government. This is often called routine or standard of care. And it's what we know works for most people and is the care you would get if you go to your doctor for regular appointments or if you have had a health problem. But when you participate in a clinical trial, you're not able to self-select the clinical trial, meaning you're not choosing the type of treatment or care that you are receiving. And before participating, the study protocol has specific guidelines to follow, including inclusion and exclusion criteria. This helps to ensure first that the clinical trial is conducted and managed objectively, along with ensuring that there is a diverse group of individuals participating in the study. The goal of many clinical trials is that the drug being studied is effective enough to someday become standard of care or a routine treatment option. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And now we're going to move into the facilitated conversation. And I'm going to welcome back here our panel for that conversation. So I'm going to begin with a few of the questions to get us going, and then include some great audience questions that we've received. So first off, I'm going to start with Dr. Deskier. We heard a bit about the different phases of a clinical trial for larger type studies. Could you please elaborate a bit more on how rare disease clinical trials are different from common disease clinical trials?
I mean, the biggest difference is probably the amount of people that can be enrolled in the trial. So you can have, with conditions like diabetes or heart disease, for example, you can have very large numbers of patients. And here you have like a much smaller number where you might have 20 cases of this condition worldwide. And you really have to work out the statistics to make sure that you have the right amount of data over the right amount of time to actually get the study to be significant, statistically significant, so that the drug can actually be approved.
And then I think the other barrier or challenge in rare disease clinical trials is establishment of biomarkers, just really understanding how therapies work in these different diseases. And so, you know, something again, like was mentioned about diabetes, that's a really well understood condition and there are already therapies approved, but in rare disease this is often the first time that there's been a therapy, and so we don't always know what it looks like to have a positive effect.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to take an audience question now and really open it up to Mel and then Jen. What is one question that was important for you to ask or have answered for you to make your decision to join a study? And now having participated, what's the most important question you would advise someone to ask when making that decision? I'll go to Mel first and then Jen.
A question that I always like to ask is, have any other people had this drug yet? Or are we going to be the first ones to try this? Of course, it's tested extensively before it gets to people, but I like to know where we're at in that phase.
Thank you. Jen, how about you?
I think those are very important questions. I would say that my instinct is to ask questions about the data that exists around this and why do they think it's going to work, to put it in simple terms. So what do you know about this therapy that leads you to believe that it's going to do something? And then something very important now for patients to consider asking, and this is not something I would have asked back when my sons were in their first clinical trial, but you know more when you experience it longer, is what are the lasting implications? So something like a gene therapy study, once you are in a clinical trial, you may not be eligible for future clinical trials. And so it's very important when I counsel patients, I never tell them what study they should enter into, but ask that question because you don't want to end up eliminating yourself from future clinical trials and also from having flexibility to choose what therapies you want to take. Once you're in a clinical trial, you often can't change any of your current treatments. For example, my son was on a stable dose of steroids, and even though he gained weight, he couldn't change his dose of steroids throughout the study because you're not allowed to make any changes. So those are some important questions that I would consider if I were looking into a study now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much both for those answers. Another question for Dr. Daskier and potentially Jen as well. We're starting to get some questions about FDA in the process. First off, along with the FDA's oversight of clinical trials, could you speak to any additional oversight and protections that exist for pediatric clinical trials? Dr. Daskier first.
So basically, I think we touched upon in the presentation that there is a investigational review board, the IRB, that is unique to the institution to make sure that, you know, the trial is fair, safe, to be run at that specific institution. So there, you know, the FDA is one agency, but there are agencies within the FDA that are put in place simply to protect those patients that are going through a trial. And similarly, I do have a lot of faith in the safety of this system. There are a lot of safety nets to capture adverse events and to protect children in studies.
Maybe Dr. Daskier, you could elaborate a little bit more on that level of confidentiality that's needed and the importance of having a trial be blinded.
Yeah, so I can speak to my own experience in that I'm an eternal optimist. So if you were to give me a sugar pill and say it was a drug, I'd probably be influenced by it. If you were to give a placebo drug to a patient, I probably would think my patient is getting better. And you might think that you can think clearly about things and be very objective, but it's really, really hard to be objective as a clinician and as an evaluator.
And as a follow-up question, I think this is fair for both sides, for both the clinicians involved as well as caregivers and patients. In the era of social media, are you concerned about your patients, about patients and caregivers sharing information when participating in a clinical trial, and how do you mitigate that?
I mean, in my opinion, and I think that's very hard to control. There's some level of good faith. But do people spill things? I think it's possible. It's really hard to monitor it though. So I'm not sure, like I don't have access to all, like I'm part of some parent groups, but not all parent groups in some of the disorders that I treat. And I do see people posting things that may or may not be appropriate. It's not my job to police that. But yeah, social media is a the wild, wild west, like, you know, in terms of like what kind of information you're receiving as well, whether or not it's correct or not. Some, you know, I guess the risk is like someone could be reporting that they're having side effects in a trial and don't get in on this trial. I could totally see that happening. So it's really hard. People, when they sign the consent form, there's some level of discretion and confidentiality that exists. And whether or not that gets implemented is primarily good faith.
Great. Thank you for that. And any additional thoughts, Jen or Mel, on those questions? Or I've got a couple more for you. So actually, this one's for Mel and Jen specifically. What can a parent or caregiver for a patient expect on the first day of the visit to the research center and with the study nurse and team? And then, of course, following on from that, what's it like during the course of the study? Mel, how about you first?
The first day it can be pretty intense. In my experience, you get a stack of papers and someone sits down with you and you spend a couple hours going over these papers. They make sure that you completely understand what you are about to participate in. And I feel like there was already a mention of that beforehand. You already have a little meeting, and then the first day you have more paperwork, and they really walk you through the process. We also had, they wanted urine samples and blood samples. For our studies, there were multiple blood draws throughout that day. They even got us a hotel room, and they gave us food vouchers, and we were able to go and rest at the hotel room in between. Another study, we had to stay in the hospital room, the entire day and be monitored. So it really depends on the specific drug and how they're handling it that day. But it's hours. The first day for one study ended up being like 2.5 days. So it can really be extended, and you can't really wander too far away from that hospital room or that lab that first day. You step away for a few minutes, you come back. It's pretty intense, but it's worth it.
Yeah, thank you.
The other thing, and I actually, Jen and I were speaking about this before in the past, is that you will get additional testing that will happen as part of the trial. And the results of these you may or may not be privy to. So again, it's really important to maintain the standard of care locally. Like even if you're getting like an echocardiogram as part of the trial, you need to have that local echo to be tracked over time locally as part of the care of your, for example, Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So I think it is, the word we used before was an enhancement of care, better access to experts, but not a substitution for the standard of care that you get back home with your local provider.
Thanks so much. Mel, I was wondering if you might have anything to add, you want to add there as far as the differences or how complementary the experience can be.
Well, something that I've noticed is when you go see your regular doctor, you can ask them questions and they have answers for you. And that's a big thing. And when you're in a clinical trial, it's the doctors that are asking you questions and you're giving them the answers.
Thank you. I'm actually going to have to cut it off right there because we come to time on our panel. I want to thank all three of you so much, Dr. Deskier and Jen McNary and Mel Havert. Thank you so much for being a part of our panel today. And we are going to start to wrap things up. I just wanted to mention before we go that we do have a lot of resources to share with you from both Global Genes at globalgenes.org, from the FDA and clinicaltrials.gov and CISCRP as well. So please, by all means, for those who are in attendance, check out all of those resources. And now I'm going to turn it back to our teammates at CISCRP to kind of close us out.
Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. My name is Joan Chambers. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing and Outreach for CISCRP. I'd like to say thank you to Global Genes for their partnership and collaboration on this very first webinar, which is of a 3-part webinar series. As Christian mentioned at the very beginning, Global Genes is a nonprofit organization dedicated to eliminating the burdens and the challenges of rare diseases for patients and families globally, which we've heard about today, amongst other topics. The organization serves the more than 400 million people around the globe and nearly 1 in 10 Americans affected by rare disease. Thank you to Christian, Dr. Deskier, Jen, Melanie, and Stephanie for the presentations and definitely the lively conversation, and for everyone who attended today. The webinar was recorded, so the link will be made available to all attendees in our follow-up thank you and published on the SysScript website. As you note on this slide, our next series is on June 9th at 12 p.m., Clinical Research, The Next Steps, which will be moderated in collaboration with NORD, National Organization for Rare Disorders. And the third webinar, November 10th at 12 p.m., Clinical Research After Participation, Paying It Forward, moderated by Every Life Foundation for Rare Disease. So again, thank you very much for attending. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you for your support.